Imagine stepping off a bus at the edge of the East River, where fog rolls across 400 acres that most New Yorkers have never seen. The air smells of salt water and something else, something institutional, something wrong. Ahead of you stretches a bridge just 4,000 feet long, but it might as well span centuries, because on the other side sits Rikers Island. For 8 decades, this place processed human beings like inventory. Teenagers, kids who should have been worried about basketball tryouts and algebra tests, were fed into a machine designed for efficiency, not healing. The numbers are staggering. New York City spent over $500,000 per year, per inmate. More than $500,000 to warehouse a single human being in a system that produced trauma more efficiently than any therapeutic outcome. But here's what's even more disturbing. By the mid-2010s, federal investigators discovered that this impossibly expensive machine was systematically brutalizing the most vulnerable people in its care. Surveillance cameras recorded beatings. Medical records documented the psychological destruction of developing minds. And for 40 years, the city's response was silence. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of leaked video footage would eventually bring down this empire of concrete and steel. But the real story isn't about one beating, or one teenager, or even one institution. It's about what happens when a society decides that efficiency matters more than dignity. When we build systems that process people instead of helping them. Today, we're crossing that bridge. We're walking those empty corridors. We're opening the files that document one of the most expensive failures in American criminal justice history. Because understanding Rikers Island means understanding something deeper about the systems we build, the shortcuts we take, and the promises we break when we think nobody's watching. This is the forensic autopsy of an institution that turned children into inventory, and what it cost all of us when the machine finally broke down. The bridge stretches just 4,000 feet across the East River, but it might as well span centuries. On one side lies Queens, with its row houses and corner delis, the hum of ordinary life. On the other side sits 413 acres that most New Yorkers have never seen, never wanted to see, and until recently, were never meant to see. Rikers Island emerges from the water like an industrial mirage. No welcoming lights, no residential warmth, just the stark geometry of concrete and steel, rising from what was once marshland, once a dumping ground for a city's refuse. The fog rolls in most evenings, wrapping around the guard towers and razor wire, as if the river itself is trying to hide what humanity built here. Fewer people have walked these grounds than have visited most foreign capitals. Fewer still have returned to tell the story of what happens when a city decides that efficiency matters more than dignity, when speed becomes more important than safety, when the architecture of control becomes a factory for violence. This is the story of Rikers Island. But more than that, it's the story of what we built here, what we fed into it, and what it gave back to us. Because for 40 years, New York City took its most vulnerable population, teenagers barely old enough to drive, kids whose brains were still forming, whose impulses were still learning limits, and fed them into a machine designed for efficiency, not healing. The machine worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. Tonight, we cross that bridge. We walk those corridors. We count the cost. Because understanding Rikers Island means understanding something deeper about the systems we build, the shortcuts we take, and the promises we break when we think no one is watching. The story begins where all stories of institutional horror begin, with the best of intentions. In 1932, New York City had a problem. The borough jails were bursting. Manhattan's Tombs was a Victorian nightmare of overcrowding and disease. Brooklyn's Raymond Street Jail was condemned, but still in use. The Bronx facility was falling apart. Queens had no jail at all. The city needed a solution. Something modern, something efficient, something that could grow with the city's needs. Enter Rikers Island, 400 acres of marshland in the East River, already owned by the city, already isolated from the neighborhoods that might complain about a jail in their backyard. The distance from Queens was just far enough to discourage escape attempts, just close enough for staff to commute. Perfect. The engineering challenge was immense. The island sat low in the water, built on decades of garbage and landfill. The foundation was literally trash. Compressed refuse, ash from municipal incinerators, debris from demolished buildings. To build a jail here, engineers had to drive concrete pilings deep through layers of decomposing waste, searching for something solid to anchor to. City planners called it land reclamation. Critics called it building on a foundation of garbage. Both were right. The early blueprints were ambitious. Multiple facilities spread across the island, modern cell blocks with proper ventilation and lighting, administrative buildings, medical facilities, a power plant, even a small farm. This wasn't just a jail. It was a complete correctional city, isolated and self-sufficient. The design philosophy was simple. Centralization equals efficiency. Instead of maintaining multiple outdated facilities across the boroughs, Rikers would process all of New York City's pretrial detainees and short-term sentenced inmates in one location. Streamlined operations, reduced costs, better control. On paper, it made perfect sense. The first buildings rose in the late 1930s. Prefabricated cell blocks, arranged in straight lines for easier supervision. Thick concrete walls designed to muffle sound between units. Narrow windows that provided light but prevented communication between buildings. Everything was engineered for control. The architects were proud of their work. Rikers represented the latest thinking in correctional design. Clean lines, functional spaces, no wasted movement. Even the landscaping was minimal. Open sight lines meant fewer places to hide contraband or plan escapes. The walls were built thick enough that screams from one tier wouldn't disturb another. Silence, the planners understood, was essential to maintaining order. By 1935, the first inmates arrived. The initial reviews were glowing. Inspectors praised the facility's cleanliness, its organization, its modern approach to detention. Here was proof that American corrections could be both humane and efficient. What the early planners hadn't considered was scale. The original design assumed a stable population of adult inmates serving short sentences or awaiting trial. But New York was growing. Crime was evolving. And soon the city would face a new question: what to do with the teenagers? The decision, when it came, seemed logical. Rikers already existed. It already had the infrastructure. Adding a youth section would be more cost-effective than building a separate juvenile facility. The teenagers would be housed in their own units, separated from the adults by locked doors and careful scheduling. Separation would exist on paper. Reality, as it turned out, would be much thinner. The youth facilities opened quietly in the 1940s. No grand announcements, no special ceremonies. Teenagers simply became part of the Rikers population, another category to be processed, housed, and managed. The island now held everyone from 16-year-olds awaiting family court hearings to adult inmates serving sentences for serious felonies. A locked door was often the only thing separating a teenager from an adult predator. Movement schedules meant that young inmates regularly crossed paths with older, more experienced criminals during meals, medical calls, and court transport. Staff were trained to work with adult populations. The assumption was that teenagers would adapt to adult rules, adult schedules, adult consequences. No special training was provided. No additional oversight was implemented. Teenagers were simply smaller adults, the thinking went. They would learn quickly. And they did learn, just not what anyone had intended. The early years established patterns that would define Rikers for decades. Efficiency took precedence over individual needs. Processing speed mattered more than rehabilitation outcomes. Control was maintained through isolation, both from the outside world and between different populations within the complex. The machine was running. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do: contain people efficiently and cheaply. The fact that some of those people were children was simply another operational detail to be managed. But machines, once started, develop their own momentum. They create their own logic. And the logic of Rikers was about to become something its creators never intended. By the 1950s, the island complex was expanding. New housing units, expanded medical facilities, a larger kitchen, more administrative space. Each addition followed the same design philosophy: functionality over comfort, efficiency over humanity. The teenagers adapted to this environment the way teenagers always adapt, by creating their own rules, their own hierarchies, their own methods of survival. What the adults called discipline, the young inmates experienced as a daily struggle for safety and status. Guards, overwhelmed by the growing population and understaffed shifts, relied increasingly on informal power structures to maintain order. If the older inmates could keep the younger ones in line, that was fewer problems for overworked staff to handle. The arrangement worked in its way. The island remained secure. Escapes were rare. Violence, when it occurred, was contained within the walls. From the outside, Rikers looked like a success story. But success was being measured in the wrong metrics. Recidivism rates didn't appear in the annual reports. The psychological impact of isolation wasn't tracked. The long-term effects of housing teenagers alongside adults wasn't studied. The only numbers that mattered were bed counts, overtime hours, and annual budgets. And by those measures, Rikers was performing exactly as intended. The foundation was set, the blueprint was established, the machine was operational. All that remained was to see what 40 years of efficient processing would produce. The island sat in the East River, connected to the world by a single bridge, surrounded by water and silence and the growing weight of its own momentum. Inside its walls, a generation of New York's young people would learn lessons that no curriculum had ever planned to teach. Those lessons would echo far beyond the island shores, far beyond the sentences served within its walls. Because Rikers Island wasn't just processing inmates. It was producing a particular kind of damage, systematic, predictable, and designed into the very architecture of the place. The blueprints were complete. The buildings were occupied. The staff had found their rhythms. Now the real experiment could begin. The alarm sounds at 5:30 every morning, cutting through the darkness like a blade through silence. It echoes off concrete walls, bounces down empty corridors, penetrates cells where teenagers lie on thin mattresses, staring at ceilings they've memorized down to the last water stain. This is how time begins at Rikers Island, not with sunrise or bird song, but with the mechanical shriek of institutional routine. The sound means the same thing every day. You belong to us now. Your time is our time. Your movements are our movements. For a 16-year-old named Marcus, we'll call him Marcus because his real name is sealed in juvenile records, this sound has been splitting his dreams for 8 months. 8 months of pretrial detention while lawyers argue over evidence and court dates get postponed. 8 months of learning that time moves differently when you're waiting for someone else to decide your future. Marcus has been awake for an hour already. Sleep comes in fragments here, broken by the sounds of other people's nightmares, by the fluorescent lights that never quite go dark, by the knowledge that every day will be exactly like the one before. The count begins at 6. Guards walk the tiers, checking each cell, marking clipboards, ensuring that every body is accounted for. 24 teenagers in this housing unit, 24 kids who should be worrying about algebra tests and basketball tryouts, and whether that girl from chemistry class likes them back. Instead, they're learning different mathematics. How long until the next meal? How many days until their next court date? How many months until they turn 18 and get transferred to the adult side of the complex? Marcus knows these numbers by heart. Breakfast in 40 minutes if the kitchen is fully staffed. Court transport maybe next week, if his lawyer can get on the calendar. Adult facility in 18 months, assuming his case doesn't resolve before his birthday. The escort system controls everything. No movement without permission. No permission without available staff. And staff, Marcus has learned, is always in short supply. Officer Rodriguez has been working doubles for 3 weeks straight. She's responsible for 24 teenagers spread across 3 tiers with no backup until the evening shift arrives. When fights break out, she handles them alone. When medical emergencies occur, she makes the call to lock down the unit while waiting for help. Rodriguez never wanted to work with kids. She trained for adult corrections, applied for adult corrections, got assigned to adult corrections. Then budget cuts shifted staff around, and suddenly she's managing teenagers with 40 hours of training that focused on crowd control and paperwork processing. The escort to breakfast should take 10 minutes. This morning it takes 45. Rodriguez is called away to handle an incident on another tier. Someone tried to hang themselves with a bedsheet, and protocol requires all available staff to respond. 24 teenagers sit locked in their cells, listening to alarms in the distance, wondering if someone they know just tried to die. Breakfast gets cold in the serving trays. The schedule falls behind before the day has really started. This is how time works at Rikers. Not linear, but circular. Every delay creates another delay. Every shortage creates another shortage. The system runs on momentum, and that momentum is always toward breakdown. When the escort finally happens, the teenagers move in single file down corridors designed to prevent conversation. The walls are painted institutional green, a color chosen, according to some study from the 1960s, to reduce anxiety. Instead, it gives everything the look of a hospital where people come to die. The dining hall can seat 200, but today only half the seats are filled. Budget cuts have reduced meal service. Some units eat breakfast, others wait until lunch. Efficiency demands that kitchen staff prepare fewer meals, not better meals. Marcus sits at a table with 3 other kids. They don't speak much. Conversation is monitored, and anything that sounds like planning or organizing gets you written up. A disciplinary report means time in solitary. Time in solitary means missing court dates, missing visits, missing any chance of getting out. The food is nutritionally adequate and deliberately bland. Flavor, like privacy, like comfort, is a privilege that has to be earned through compliance. The eggs are powdered. The bread is day-old. The milk is lukewarm and tastes like the industrial refrigeration unit that stored it. 30 minutes for 200 inmates to eat. 30 minutes to consume calories and nothing else. No lingering, no conversation, no human pleasure in the basic act of nourishment. The escort back to housing takes another hour. Someone on the second tier is refusing to come out of his cell for a disciplinary hearing. Protocol requires the unit to remain on lockdown until the situation is resolved. 23 teenagers sit in the corridor, listening to negotiations they can't see, waiting for permission to return to their cells. Marcus counts tiles on the floor. 2,043 white tiles, each one exactly 6 inches square. He's counted them before. He'll count them again. Counting is something you can control when nothing else responds to your will. This is Tuesday. Tuesday looks exactly like Monday, which looked exactly like Sunday. Weekends don't exist here. Holidays are just days when fewer staff show up for work, which means longer lockdowns, longer delays, more time to count tiles and memorize water stains and listen to the sound of your own breathing echo off concrete walls. Education happens 3 days a week. If the teacher shows up, if there's a guard available for escort, if the classroom isn't being used for something else. Marcus is supposed to be finishing his junior year of high school. Instead, he sits through lessons designed for middle schoolers, taught by a substitute teacher who doesn't know anyone's name and doesn't plan to learn them. The classroom has no windows. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting everything in the same gray pallor that defines every interior space on the island. Textbooks are outdated and missing pages. Supplies are limited to pencils and worksheets photocopied until the text is barely readable. Marcus used to like history. He had a teacher at his high school in Brooklyn who made the Civil War sound like something that mattered, something that connected to his life and his neighborhood and his future. Here, history is just names and dates to be memorized for a test that might or might not happen, depending on the staffing schedule. Recreation is an hour in a concrete yard surrounded by 20-foot walls. No grass, no trees, no horizon. Just gray concrete under gray sky, with razor wire catching whatever light manages to penetrate the permanent overcast that seems to hang over the island. Some days, the hour gets shortened to 30 minutes. Budget constraints, staff shortage, security concerns. The reasons change. but the result is the same. Less time outside, less movement, less anything that might remind you that there's a world beyond these walls. Marcus plays basketball when he can, on a court where the rims have no nets and the backboards are cracked and patched. The ball bounces wrong off the broken asphalt, but muscle memory still works. His jump shot still finds its mark. For 20 minutes, he can almost forget where he is. Then the whistle blows. Line up. Count off. Return to housing. The day folds back into routine. Medical care happens on Tuesdays and Fridays, assuming the nurse is available, assuming the medical transport van is running, assuming your request is considered urgent enough to warrant attention. Marcus has been asking for 3 months to see a dentist about a broken molar. The pain comes and goes, sharp and sudden, like his body's way of reminding him that even small problems become large problems when you can't address them. The medical unit is understaffed like everything else. 1 nurse for 400 inmates, 1 doctor who comes twice a week. Dental care is considered elective unless you're bleeding from the mouth. Marcus learns to live with the pain. He learns to chew on one side. He learns that discomfort is just another feature of institutional life, like bad food and fluorescent lighting, and the constant background noise of other people's misery. Visits happen on weekends for those lucky enough to have family members who can navigate the bureaucracy of visitor approval, who can take time off work, who can afford the transportation to an island that's accessible only by bridge and city bus. Marcus's mother comes when she can. She works 2 jobs and takes care of his younger sister, and the trip to Rikers takes most of a Saturday. They sit across from each other at a plastic table in a room full of other families, having the same stilted conversations, supervised by guards who listen to every word. 30 minutes. No physical contact except a brief hug at the beginning and end. No privacy. No normal human connection. Just 2 people who love each other, separated by rules and procedures, and the institutional logic that treats affection as a security risk. His mother brings news from the outside world. His sister made honor roll. His grandmother is asking about him. His old basketball coach got the team to the playoffs. Life is continuing without him, which is both comforting and terrifying. Marcus wants to tell her about the dreams that wake him up at night, about the older kid who tried to take his commissary money, about the guard who seems to enjoy making teenagers wait in handcuffs just a little longer than necessary, but the words don't come. How do you explain that you're disappearing, piece by piece, in a place designed to make people disappear? Instead, he tells her he's fine, he's keeping his head down, he's staying out of trouble. The lies come easily because the truth would break her heart, and she has enough to carry already. Dinner is served at 4:30, the same institutional green walls, the same lukewarm milk, the same carefully measured portions designed to provide nutrition without pleasure. Marcus eats mechanically, fuel for a body that spends most of its time waiting. Evening lockdown begins at 8. 24 teenagers in 24 cells, with 14 hours until morning count. 14 hours to think about everything you can't change, everyone you miss, everything you've lost by being here. The lights dim but never fully darken. Security requirements, suicide prevention. The fluorescent glow creeps under the door, around the edges of the window, into dreams and nightmares alike. Marcus lies on his mattress and counts backward from 1,000. It's a technique his grandmother taught him when he was little and couldn't sleep during thunderstorms. 999, 998, 997, somewhere around 600, he usually falls asleep. When he wakes, it will be to the same alarm, the same count, the same escort delays, the same institutional green walls. Tomorrow will be exactly like today, which was exactly like yesterday. This is how time moves at Rikers Island. Not forward toward redemption or backward toward understanding, but in an endless circle that wears away hope like water wearing away stone, slowly, steadily, until what remains is just the shape of what used to be. The machine processes another day, efficiently, quietly, exactly as designed. But machines don't feel the weight of time. They don't dream of basketball courts with real nets or classrooms with windows or families who can visit without navigating razor wire and metal detectors. Marcus feels all of it. Every wasted hour, every missed opportunity, every day that passes without bringing him closer to anything that looks like justice or healing or hope. 8 months down. An unknown number to go. The mathematics of incarceration, where time is the only currency, and no one knows the exchange rate. The alarm will sound again in 6 hours. The count will begin. The machine will process another day, and Marcus will wake up to discover once again that he's still here, still waiting, still learning lessons that no teenager should ever have to learn. But he's not learning them alone. 23 other teenagers are counting tiles and memorizing water stains and trying to sleep under fluorescent light. Hundreds more throughout the complex. Thousands more over the decades. All of them feeding into a system that measures success by bed counts and budget efficiency, not by the human cost of turning children into inventory. The machine doesn't care about the human cost. That's what makes it efficient. That's also what makes it so dangerous. The video runs for exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. 3 minutes and 47 seconds that would eventually bring down an empire built on silence and isolation and the assumption that what happens on an island stays on an island. The timestamp reads February 15th, 2014, 11:37 p.m. The camera angle is fixed, mounted high on the wall of a corridor in the Robert N. Davern complex, the section of Rikers Island designated for inmates aged 16 to 18. The lens captures a stretch of institutional green hallway, fluorescent lighting, and a set of steel doors that lead to the solitary confinement unit. What the camera records is this: 4 correction officers escorting a handcuffed teenager down the corridor. The teenager is Khalif Browder, 17 years old, accused of stealing a backpack. He's been on Rikers Island for 2 years without trial, most of that time in solitary confinement, waiting for a legal system that seems to have forgotten he exists. The escort appears routine until it isn't. One officer says something. Browder responds. Words are exchanged, then fists, then batons, then a teenager on the ground while 4 grown men deliver blows that the camera records but no one stops. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of violence, captured in black and white, time-stamped and filed and forgotten, until a reporter named Jennifer Gonerman starts asking questions about a young man who spent 3 years on Rikers Island for a crime he insisted he never committed. The video leaks in 2014. By then, Browder is already dead, suicide by hanging in his family's Bronx home 2 years after his release. The footage becomes evidence not just of one beating, but of a system so broken that it routinely brutalizes children and documents its own brutality with mechanical indifference. But the Browder video is just the beginning. Federal investigators arrive on Rikers Island in 2014 with court orders and subpoenas and a mandate to examine every aspect of operations. What they find is a pattern so consistent, so systematic, that individual incidents blur into institutional practice. Use of force reports tell the story in bureaucratic language. Subject non-compliant during cell search. Inmate exhibited aggressive behavior during escort. Necessary force applied to maintain security. Each report follows the same template, uses the same phrases, describes violence as if it were a natural phenomenon rather than a choice made by human beings. The investigators dig deeper. They analyze incident reports by date, by shift, by housing unit. They map patterns of violence across time and space. What emerges is a clear picture. Certain guards, working certain shifts in certain units, consistently use force against certain populations. Young inmates, Black and Latino inmates, inmates with mental health issues. The pattern isn't random, it's predictable. And predictability suggests intent. Dr. Robert Cohen, a psychiatrist and expert in correctional medicine, spends 6 months on Rikers Island as part of the federal investigation. He interviews staff, reviews medical records, observes daily operations. His report, filed in December 2014, runs 412 pages and reads like a medical examiner's report on institutional death. Cohen documents the routine use of solitary confinement for teenagers, not as punishment for serious infractions, but as a management tool for understaffed units. Kids are placed in isolation for rule violations as minor as talking back to staff or refusing to stand for count. Some spend weeks in cells, lit 24 hours a day, with no human contact except meals passed through slots. The psychological impact is immediate and severe: sleep deprivation from constant lighting, anxiety from social isolation, paranoia from the stress of confinement, depression that can last years after release. Some teenagers begin talking to themselves. Others stop talking altogether. Cohen's report includes interviews with corrections staff who describe solitary confinement as the only tool we have for managing difficult inmates. But the teenagers being isolated aren't hardened criminals. They're kids awaiting trial for minor offenses, kids with undiagnosed mental health issues, kids whose main transgression is being young and scared in an environment designed for adult offenders. The federal investigation expands. Investigators interview former inmates, current staff, medical personnel, administrators. They review 15 years of incident reports, medical records, surveillance footage. They analyze staffing patterns, training protocols, disciplinary procedures. What they document is systematic failure at every level. Guards routinely use excessive force with no consequences. Medical staff fail to treat obvious injuries. Administrators falsify reports to hide patterns of abuse. The entire system operates on the principle that accountability is less important than maintaining control. The numbers tell their own story. Between 2012 and 2014, Rikers Island recorded over 800 incidents of use of force against inmates. 68% involved inmates under 21 years old. 43% resulted in serious injuries requiring hospitalization. 800 documented incidents in a facility that houses roughly 11,000 inmates over 3 years. The investigators realize that what they're seeing isn't a collection of individual failures. It's the predictable output of a system designed to prioritize control over humanity. But the most damning evidence comes from the financial analysis. New York City is spending an average of $568,000 per year per inmate at Rikers Island, more than $500,000 per person. Enough money to send a dozen kids to college, enough money to fund comprehensive mental health services, job training programs, educational initiatives. Instead, the money buys cells and guards and an archipelago of suffering that produces trauma more efficiently than any therapeutic outcome. The investigators interview teenagers who describe daily life on the island, kids who haven't seen sunlight for weeks because outdoor recreation is canceled due to staff shortages, kids who haven't attended school for months because teachers quit and aren't replaced, kids who are prescribed psychotropic medications by doctors who see them for 5 minutes every few weeks. One 17-year-old describes being placed in solitary confinement for 96 days straight. 96 days in a cell designed for short-term punishment. 96 days with no human contact except guards who slide meal trays through slots and check for signs of self-harm every 15 minutes. The teenager, we'll call him David because his real name is protected by juvenile records, had been arrested for turnstile jumping, a $2 fare evasion that turned into a 96-day descent into psychological darkness because he got into an argument with a guard who didn't like his attitude. David describes the hallucinations that started after 2 weeks: voices in the walls, shadows moving in peripheral vision, the feeling that his skin was crawling with insects that weren't there. By day 30, he was talking to his reflection in the steel mirror, having full conversations with himself because human contact had become a memory. The medical staff noted his deteriorating condition in daily reports. Inmate appears agitated. Subject reports difficulty sleeping. Patient exhibits signs of anxiety. But no one intervened. No one moved him out of solitary. No one questioned whether 96 days of isolation might be causing more problems than it solved. David was released directly from solitary confinement to the streets of Brooklyn. No transition period, no counseling, no support services. Just a bus ride from the island to a neighborhood where kids were supposed to resume normal teenage lives after months or years of institutional trauma. The investigators interview David's mother, who describes the young man who came home. jumpier than before, afraid of small spaces, unable to sleep without lights on, suspicious of authority figures, quick to anger, slow to trust. A teenager who had learned survival skills that had no application in the civilian world. David's story multiplies across hundreds of case files. Teenagers released from Rikers Island with untreated trauma, unfinished educations, and criminal records that follow them for life. Kids who entered the system for minor offenses and emerged with psychological damage that affects every subsequent relationship, every job interview, every attempt to build normal lives. The recidivism data tells the rest of the story. 87% of teenagers released from Rikers Island are rearrested within 3 years. Not because the island failed to rehabilitate them, rehabilitation was never the goal. The island succeeded in exactly what it was designed to do: process people efficiently and cheaply. The fact that this processing created more criminals than it prevented was never measured in the annual reports. The only metrics that mattered were bed occupancy rates, per inmate costs, and operational efficiency. By those measures, Rikers Island was performing exactly as intended. Federal investigators present their findings to a federal judge in Manhattan. The report runs 700 pages and includes recommendations for immediate intervention, independent oversight, mandatory training for all staff, elimination of solitary confinement for inmates under 18, medical and mental health services provided by outside agencies, not corrections personnel. The city's response is swift and predictable. Officials promise immediate reforms, new training programs, enhanced oversight, better medical care. The same promises made after every previous investigation, the same commitments that had been forgotten as soon as media attention moved elsewhere. But this time feels different. The Browder video has aired on national television. The federal investigation has produced documentation too extensive to ignore. Public pressure is building for something more substantial than administrative adjustments. Stories emerge from other parts of the complex. Adult inmates who describe watching teenage inmates being beaten by guards. Staff members who describe a culture of impunity where excessive force is not just tolerated, but encouraged. Medical personnel who describe treating injuries that were obviously caused by beatings, then being pressured to document them as slip-and-fall incidents. The investigation expands beyond individual cases to examine the institutional culture that made such cases inevitable. Hiring practices that prioritized filling positions over screening candidates. Training programs that emphasized control techniques over de-escalation strategies. Promotion systems that rewarded officers who could maintain order, regardless of methods. Supervisors describe managing guards who were themselves traumatized by working in an environment of constant violence. Correction officers working mandatory overtime for weeks at a time. Managing populations they weren't trained to handle, using force because they didn't know any other tools for maintaining control. The system was producing its own momentum. Violence bred violence. Trauma bred trauma. And at the center of it all were teenagers whose developing brains were being shaped by daily exposure to brutality, isolation, and the lesson that power comes from the willingness to cause pain. The federal court receives testimony from psychologists who describe the specific impact of institutional trauma on adolescent brain development. Teenagers whose prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and decision-making, is still forming. Kids who are neurologically more susceptible to trauma, more likely to be permanently damaged by exposure to chronic stress and violence. The court receives testimony from educators who describe trying to teach in classrooms where students have been kept awake for weeks by fluorescent lighting, where kids arrive for class handcuffed and shackled, where learning is secondary to maintaining security protocols designed for maximum security prisons. The court receives testimony from former inmates who describe the nightmares that continue years after release, the difficulty trusting authority figures, the challenges of forming normal relationships after learning to survive in an environment where vulnerability means victimization. And finally, the court receives testimony from corrections officials who acknowledge what everyone already knows, that Rikers Island, as currently designed and operated, cannot be reformed. The physical plant is too old. The culture is too entrenched. The problems are too systematic. For the first time in the facility's 8-decade history, officials admit that the island itself, not just its policies or personnel, but its fundamental design, is the problem. The question shifts from, how do we fix Rikers, to, how do we close it? That question will take another decade to answer. But the investigation has already accomplished something unprecedented. It has forced the city to acknowledge that its most efficient jail is also its most damaging, and that efficiency without humanity doesn't reduce crime, it manufactures it. The machine is still running, still processing inmates efficiently and cheaply, still producing the exact outcomes it was designed to produce. But now everyone can see what those outcomes actually cost, not just in dollars, though the price tag is staggering, but in human terms. In teenage lives broken before they've had a chance to form, in trauma that echoes through generations, in a criminal justice system that creates more criminals than it prevents. The video that started it all, 3 minutes and 47 seconds of documented brutality, continues to play in courtrooms and congressional hearings and documentary films. A permanent record of what happens when a society decides that efficiency matters more than dignity, when buildings designed to warehouse people become machines for manufacturing damage. The image is stark and clear. A teenager on the ground, grown men delivering blows, a camera recording everything, and no one stopping the violence that the system itself had made inevitable. 3 minutes and 47 seconds, long enough to end a career, expose a system, and force a city to confront what it had built on an island in the East River. Not long enough to undo the damage. That will take generations. The last boat leaves Rikers Island at 11:45 on a Tuesday night in October 2021. No ceremony marks the occasion, no speeches, no final count or formal transfer of custody, just a corrections officer named Maria Santos, who has worked the island for 26 years, turning off the lights in housing units that will never hold another teenager. The silence is different now, not the oppressive quiet of enforced control, but the hollow echo of abandonment. Corridors that once carried the sounds of footsteps and arguments and alarms now carry only the whistle of wind through broken windows and the drip of water through ceiling leaks that no one will repair. Santos walks the empty tiers one last time, her flashlight cutting through darkness that feels permanent. Cell doors stand open, revealing spaces too small for human dignity. Mattresses stripped and stacked, toilets without seats, steel mirrors that reflect nothing but institutional green paint, and the accumulated weight of 40 years of human suffering. She pauses at cell B47, where a kid named Jerome had carved his sister's initials into the concrete wall with a plastic spoon. The marks are still there, barely visible but permanent. JT plus RT forever. Jerome served 18 months for a robbery he committed to buy his sister birthday presents. RT would be in college now, if she got the chances her brother never had. The medical unit sits empty, pharmaceutical cabinets already cleared of medications that were used to manage problems that proper treatment might have prevented. Antidepressants dispensed like aspirin, antipsychotics prescribed for behaviors that might have been responses to trauma, not symptoms of mental illness. Chemical restraints for kids who needed therapy, not medication. Dr. Sarah Chen had been the island's chief psychiatrist for 8 years. She describes her work there as practicing triage medicine on problems that required surgery. Too many patients, too little time, too few resources to address root causes. She treated symptoms because treating trauma would have required admitting that the institution itself was traumatizing. Chen kept notes on cases that haunted her. Michael, 15, who arrived with no history of mental illness and left with severe depression after 6 months in solitary confinement. Ashley, 16, who developed an eating disorder because food was the only thing she could control in an environment where nothing else responded to her choices. David, 17, who started hearing voices during his 4th month of isolation and never quite stopped, even after release. Her private notes, never included in official medical records, document the specific ways that institutional trauma manifests in developing brains: sleep disorders that persist for years after release, hypervigilance that makes normal social relationships impossible, depression that responds poorly to medication because its roots lie in environmental factors, not brain chemistry. Chen estimates that 80% of the teenagers she treated on Rikers Island showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder by the time they were released. Not PTSD from the crimes they may have committed or witnessed, but PTSD from their treatment within the criminal justice system itself. The educational building stands empty now, classrooms designed for learning but used mostly for warehousing, desks bolted to floors, windows too high to see out of, whiteboards that were never quite white, stained by years of half-erased lessons and abandoned hope. Ms. Patricia Williams taught high school equivalency classes on the island for 12 years. She describes education there as trying to plant seeds in concrete. Smart kids, many of them, creative kids, kids who could have succeeded in any normal classroom, but nothing about Rikers was normal. Williams kept detailed records of her students' academic progress, or lack thereof. Kids who missed weeks of class because of lockdowns, kids who couldn't concentrate because of medication side effects, kids who learned to read in cells lit 24 hours a day, then forgot how to sleep without bright lights. She estimates that fewer than 20% of her students ever completed their GED while incarcerated. Not because they lacked ability, but because the institution made learning nearly impossible. How do you study for algebra when your cell neighbor is screaming through nightmares? How do you write essays about your future when your present is measured in 15-minute increments between count times? Williams saved examples of her students' writing, essays about life before Rikers, poetry about missing mothers and younger siblings, letters to judges trying to explain choices that seemed logical to teenagers living in neighborhoods where violence was common and opportunity was rare. One essay, written by a 17-year-old awaiting trial for assault, describes his neighborhood in East New York. People think we're bad kids, but we're just kids in a bad situation. My little brother is 10, and he already knows which streets are safe to walk down after dark. My mom works 3 jobs and still can't pay rent sometimes. When I got arrested, I was trying to get money for groceries because we hadn't eaten dinner in 2 days. The young man who wrote that essay spent 14 months on Rikers Island before charges were dropped. 14 months out of school, 14 months away from family. 14 months learning that the system views him as a threat to be contained rather than a person to be helped. Williams tried to maintain contact with students after their release. Some succeeded in spite of their time on the island. Most struggled with reintegration into schools that didn't understand their experiences, families that had been traumatized by their absence, and communities that often viewed them as damaged goods. The administrative building houses records that tell the story in numbers that were never meant to add up to an indictment. Budget reports that show per-inmate costs rising every year, while outcomes remained unchanged. Incident reports that document patterns of violence so consistent they read like operating manuals for institutional brutality. Medical records that chronicle the systematic production of trauma in populations too young to understand what was happening to them. Commissioner Joseph Ponte served as head of New York City's Department of Correction from 2014 to 2016. His tenure coincided with the federal investigation and the beginning of serious reform efforts. He describes inheriting a system that had been optimized for the wrong outcomes. Ponte's reform efforts included ending solitary confinement for inmates under 18, implementing new use-of-force protocols, and expanding educational and therapeutic programming. But each reform ran into the same fundamental problem: the physical plant and institutional culture of Rikers Island. You can change policies overnight, Ponte explains. Changing culture takes generations, and some cultures are so entrenched that change requires starting over completely. The culture of Rikers had been shaped by decades of understaffing, inadequate training, and the daily stress of managing populations in facilities never designed for rehabilitation. Guards who started their careers wanting to help young people found themselves using force because it was the only tool the institution provided. Union Representative Norman Seabrook, who represented corrections officers for 20 years, describes the toll that working on Rikers took on staff. Nobody goes into corrections to hurt kids. But you put people in an impossible situation with impossible expectations and no real tools to succeed, and eventually they break down or they break bad. Seabrook cites statistics showing higher rates of divorce, substance abuse, and suicide among corrections officers who worked with juvenile populations. The trauma wasn't limited to inmates. It infected everyone who spent time on the island, creating cycles of dysfunction that perpetuated themselves across generations of staff and inmates. The economic analysis of Rikers Island reads like an accounting of institutional failure. The city spent $42 billion operating the complex over its 8-decade history. $42 billion to warehouse approximately 2 million people, most of them young, most of them poor, most of them from neighborhoods where schools were underfunded and social services were overwhelmed. Economic researchers calculate that the same $42 billion could have funded comprehensive educational, medical, and social services for every at-risk young person in New York City for the same period. Universal pre-K, free college tuition, job training programs, mental health services, housing assistance, drug treatment programs. The opportunity cost of Rikers Island wasn't just the money spent on incarceration. It was all the things that money might have prevented if invested in communities instead of cages. But economics, like everything else about Rikers, was never really about efficiency. It was about control, about maintaining social hierarchies that kept certain populations contained and invisible, about creating the appearance of public safety without addressing the root causes of crime. The island's closure comes not through enlightened policymaking, but through legal necessity. Federal courts, faced with evidence of systematic constitutional violations, order the city to either fix the problems or close the facilities. After decades of failed reform efforts, closure becomes the only viable option. The last teenagers leave Rikers Island in convoy buses that cross the bridge to Queens at dawn. They're transferred to new facilities in the boroughs, smaller jails, closer to families, designed with input from child development specialists rather than corrections architects. The new facilities aren't perfect. They still house young people awaiting trial, still separate families, still interrupt education and development. But they represent a different philosophy, that teenagers are developmentally different from adults, that rehabilitation requires treatment rather than punishment, that public safety is better served by addressing root causes than managing symptoms. Maria Santos, the corrections officer who turned off the last lights, describes her 26 years on the island as a career spent watching good intentions get crushed by institutional momentum. She saw individual officers who cared about young people get worn down by a system that rewarded compliance over creativity. She saw programs that worked get canceled due to budget cuts, while spending on security continued to increase. Santos estimates that she personally supervised the incarceration of over 10,000 teenagers during her career. 10,000 young people whose lives were shaped by their time in cells designed for efficiency rather than healing. Some succeeded in spite of that experience. Many didn't. The recidivism statistics tell part of the story. But statistics don't capture the broader impact of removing thousands of young people from their communities, interrupting their education and development, traumatizing their families, and teaching them that society views them as problems to be managed rather than people with potential. The true cost of Rikers Island won't be known for generations. It lives in the children of former inmates, who learned parenting from people who were taught that authority means force. It lives in communities that lost potential leaders to cells and solitary confinement. It lives in the collective trauma of neighborhoods that saw their young people disappear into a system that returned them damaged. The island itself sits empty now, buildings slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. Nature is beginning to reclaim what was taken from it 8 decades ago. Weeds grow through cracks in exercise yards. Birds nest in guard towers. Rust eats through bars that once separated teenagers from sunlight. Urban explorers who visit the abandoned complex describe an eerie silence broken only by the sound of wind through empty corridors and the drip of water through ceiling leaks. Graffiti left by former inmates still marks walls in housing units. Names, dates, messages to family members who may never know they were carved into concrete by children counting days until release. But silence doesn't erase history. The archives remain. The medical records, the incident reports, the surveillance footage, the testimonies of former inmates and staff, a comprehensive documentary record of what happens when a society decides to warehouse its young people rather than invest in their potential. That documentation serves as evidence in ongoing legal cases. Former inmates sue the city for damages related to their treatment while incarcerated. Medical experts testify about the long-term psychological impact of solitary confinement on developing brains. Economists calculate the social costs of disrupted education and traumatized families. But the documentation also serves as warning. Proof that institutional momentum can overwhelm individual intention. That good people working within bad systems can produce outcomes that none of them intended. That efficiency without humanity doesn't solve problems. It transfers them to future generations. The boats no longer carry passengers to Rikers Island. The bridge connects to empty buildings and abandoned dreams. The experiment is over, but its results echo through every community that sent its young people to those cells, through every family that waited for visiting days, through every teenager who learned about power and authority from guards who were taught that control matters more than care. 8 decades of operation. Hundreds of thousands of lives processed through a system designed to warehouse rather than heal. A $42 billion investment in the premise that public safety comes from removing problems rather than addressing them. The island stands as testament to the difference between containing people and containing the conditions that produce crime. Between managing symptoms and treating diseases. Between building walls and building bridges. Empty now. Quiet. Abandoned to wind and weather and the slow work of natural reclamation, but not forgotten, never forgotten, because the cost of forgetting would be to risk building it again, somewhere else, with different names and updated architecture and modern security systems, but the same fundamental mistake, believing that efficiency can replace empathy, that processing people can substitute for helping them, that a society can warehouse its way to safety. The bridge still spans the East River, but it carries only ghosts now. Ghosts of young people who deserved better. Ghosts of staff who tried to help within a system designed to harm. Ghosts of communities that lost their children to an experiment in institutional efficiency. The water reflects empty windows and rusted razor wire. The tide rises and falls, indifferent to human calculations of justice and efficiency, and the price societies pay for forgetting that some problems can't be solved by building bigger cages. The island waits, empty, silent, a monument to the difference between containing people and caring for them, a reminder carved in concrete and steel, that what we build shapes what we become, that the architecture of justice reflects the values of the society that designs it, that every wall we build to keep others out also keeps us in, trapped by the logic of our own making, prisoners of systems we created but no longer control. The experiment is over. The results are in. The question that remains is whether we learned enough from the failure to avoid repeating it, whether we're smart enough to build bridges instead of walls, to invest in potential rather than punishment, to measure success by the people we help rather than the problems we hide. The island has given us its answer, written in the lives of young people who deserved better, documented in 8 decades of institutional failure disguised as efficiency. The question now is what we'll do with that knowledge, whether we'll build systems that honor the dignity of every person they touch, or whether we'll just build newer, more efficient ways to repeat the same mistakes. The bridge waits, the water flows, the choices remain ours to make.